Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am thrilled to be your moderator for this special event, which we're calling Microsoft 365 Backup Checklist for 2025. It is so great to be here with you today. But before we get to the content, we do have some housekeeping items that I need to let you know about. First off, we want you to ask questions, folks. Just drop them in the questions box in your webinar control panel. At the end of the presentation today, we're going to answer the top ones that come in. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from. Let us know and keep those coming. And it's also the place to let us know if we can help you with any technical issues. Sometimes things just go wrong on live streaming internet events, as you know. If that happens, give your browser a quick refresh or two. Sometimes it takes a couple of refreshes. That should set everything right again. If it does not, let us know. We will try to give you a hand. All right. So, also, we are going to be making one of you $250 richer today, helping you maybe pay off some of those debts that you that you created over the holidays. So this is going to be an Amazon gift card, and we are going to give it away at the very end of the event. Now, remember that you do have to attend the entire event. You got to be present here to be eligible for the gift card. The official terms and conditions of the prize drawing, if you're interested, can be found in the handouts section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions right there. Now, these expert series events are special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. And we've got a great one for you today, but it is the support of our sponsors that make it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give them a special shout out. That would be Rubrik and Cohesity. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm going to share some messages from them, and they will refer also to links that you can find in that handout section, which is right there next to the questions tab. Anytime during the presentation, you can go click on those links. You will also find in that handouts section a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, which you should check out and sign up for things that look intriguing to you. Now, before we get to the main event here, I want to present a few words from our sponsors. First up today is Rubrik, which is on a mission to secure the world's data. With zero trust data security, Rubrik helps organizations achieve business resilience against cyber attacks, malicious insiders, and operational disruptions. Rubrik Security Cloud, powered by machine learning, secures data across enterprise, cloud, and SaaS applications as well. We are also sponsored today by Cohesity. More than 12,000 enterprise customers, including more than 85 of the Fortune 100 and nearly 70% of the Global 500, rely on Cohesity to strengthen their resilience while providing generative AI insights into their vast amount of data. Formed from the combination of Cohesity with Veritas's enterprise data protection business, the company's solutions secure and protect data on premises, in the cloud, and at the edge. So with that, folks, let's get to that main event that I referenced before. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, the great Brien Posey. That's Brien with an E, everyone. Now, Brian's going to tell you more about himself in a moment, but I wanted to mention here that I've been working with Brien many years and served as his editor for a ton of articles because he is a wonderful author. Now, one reason I always liked being Brian's editor is that his articles, when they came in, just didn't need much editing. They were very clean, which every editor greatly appreciates. He's also a fantastic presenter, as you are about to learn. So with no further ado, I'm going to bring Brien on here. Brien, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are you able to hear me? Because my audio was cutting out until about 30 seconds ago.
Absolutely. I can hear you just perfect right now. So sounds like your audio is all solved. We'll hope that holds up throughout the event here. So you are on deck, sir. Take it away.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. So hello, greetings, and welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking all about a Microsoft 365 backup checklist for 2025. So before I get into the presentation, just a couple of quick words about me. As Keith mentioned, I'm Brien Posey. I'm a longtime freelance technology author and speaker. I'm also a commercial astronaut candidate. I've been actively training for a commercial space mission for the last 10 years, and I'm a former 22-time Microsoft MVP. So let's go ahead and get into things. Now, one thing that I do want to point out before I get started is that my goal in creating this presentation was to make it so that there would hopefully be something in here for absolutely everyone. So not every checklist item that I'm going to be covering is going to be applicable to every situation, and that's okay. Some of these are geared toward people who have never backed up Microsoft 365 before. Others are going to be geared towards experts, and still other suggestions are going to be geared towards those who take a set it and forget it approach to backups. Maybe they set up backups at one point and never touch them again. So I'm going to be talking about some things to revisit and update. Now, one other thing that I want to mention before I really get into the checklist items is that this is a checklist only in the very loosest sense of the word. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, over my career, I've seen quite a few IT checklists, and I couldn't tell you how many times I've taken a look at one of those checklists and reacted by saying something like, I'm not doing that, or why in the world would they suggest this? So rather than just give you a list of rules to follow and check boxes to check off, my goal is to make you think about some of the checklist items. So rather than just giving you a static checklist, I'm going to be approaching this from the standpoint of asking questions that will hopefully lead to more thinking and help you to realize the things that you need to do within your own Microsoft 365 environment. So let's get started. So the first best practice that I want to talk about is defining your backup goals. So the first question is, what is it specifically that you need to protect? Now, in the context of Microsoft 365 backups, this question seems utterly ridiculous. I'll be the first to admit that, but there is a method to the madness because different organizations use different parts of Microsoft 365. Maybe your organization only uses Exchange, or maybe they only use SharePoint or OneDrive or something like that. So you may only need to protect a subset of Microsoft 365. Having said that, my recommendation would be, even if you're only using part of Microsoft 365, back up everything, even if you don't feel like you need it. Yes, I realize that that increases overhead and storage cost, but there's a very important reason why I say this. Actually, two reasons. One is, just because you're not using a particular part of Microsoft 365 today doesn't mean you'll never use it. So if you're already backing up the full Microsoft 365 tenant, then you're a step ahead of the game if you start using something else a little bit later on. The other and more important reason why I recommend this is because sometimes the various Microsoft 365 applications store data in weird places. Throughout the history of IT, what we typically had was an application that would store data in a very specific location. As an example, Microsoft Word. If you create a Word document, you know that your document is going to be stored in a docx file. That's kind of a given. Similarly, if you create an Exchange mailbox, you know that that mailbox is going to reside inside the Exchange information store. Simple enough. But not every Microsoft 365 application is like that. Teams, for example, doesn't have its own defined data type. There's no such thing as the Teams store that stores all of the Teams data. Instead, Teams stores some data in Exchange, it stores some in SharePoint, it even stores some of the data inside of Azure. So there's no such thing as a Teams data repository, data scattered everywhere. So if you're using Teams, it's really important to back up everything just because data is so widely scattered. And Teams isn't the only example of this. There are other applications such as Microsoft Planner that don't have their own data type. Instead, they piggyback on top of other Microsoft 365 applications. So my recommendation is back up absolutely everything, whether you need it or not. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So moving right along, the next question on the list. Do you have business or compliance mandates that you need to meet? It's a fairly straightforward question. Are you subject to regulatory compliance? If not, great. If so, then what are those compliance requirements? But even if you don't have any compliance requirements, there are operational requirements defined by the business. So you need to make sure that whatever approach you take to backups is going to meet those business operating needs. The next question is, what are your RPO and RTO requirements? Now, these are really standard terms that I'm guessing most people are probably familiar with, but just for the benefit of anybody who might be new, RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective. It basically refers to how frequently are you creating backups. The more frequent your RPO, the less data you stand to lose should you have to perform a restoration. Let me give you a quick example. Back many, many years ago when I first started my IT career, standard practice at the time was to perform a nightly backup. So let's suppose that you start a backup at midnight and then you have a crash the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you have to restore that backup. Well, in a situation like that, you're going to lose all of the data that's accumulated since that last backup was made. So in this example, you have an RPO or recovery point objective of 24 hours because you're making one backup every night. Now, modern backup solutions can create backups much more frequently. Some backups create RPOs hourly, some create backups in near real time. The solution that I use in my own environment, for example, creates backups every 30 seconds. So what type of RPO does your organization need in order to minimize data loss should a restore become necessary? Because anytime that you perform a restoration, you're going to lose some amount of data, whether we're talking about a few seconds worth of data, hours worth of data, a day's worth of data. There's always going to be some degree of data loss that will typically occur. RTO stands for recovery time objective, and that refers to how long it's going to take to restore a backup. Because if you've got a massive data set and you need to restore all of it, that restoration is not going to happen instantaneously. It's going to take a little bit of time to restore all of that data. And depending on your connection speed and the volume of data and several other factors, that could be a matter of hours or days, who knows? So it's important to take a look at how long is it realistically going to take to restore all of your Microsoft 365 data, and is that restore time acceptable for your business needs? And if it's not, then you should be taking a look at what you might be able to do to expedite the restoration process. This might involve creating a plan to restore certain types of data first, so that way the most important data is brought online before the less important data. And there are some other things that you might be able to do to minimize that restoration time. Another thing to look at is where should backups be stored? And this is kind of an open-ended question. It's something I'm going to get into a little bit more later on, but do you want to store your Microsoft 365 backups locally in your own data center somewhere? Do you want them in the cloud? If so, which cloud? Are you going to store to removable media? What about data sovereignty? Is there a requirement to keep your data within a certain country or within a certain region? Those are all things that have to be considered. And on a side note, I would absolutely recommend storing your backup data in more than one location. In my own organization, I take a multi-tier approach to backups, and I'll go into this in more detail later on, but I have a primary backup, and then I also do air gap backups and immutable backups. So I take a three-stage approach to backups in my organization. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit more later on if time allows. And that actually leads into the next point. Will you use air gapped backups? And if so, what are your policies for handling removable media? An air-gapped backup is just a backup that's written to removable media and then ejected from the system, kind of like an old school tape backup. It can also be a backup that's written to a removable hard disk. So in a way, this approach seems really counterintuitive, especially given what I just talked about a few minutes ago with regard to RPOs. Because if you're writing backups to removable media, well, those can't be done nearly as frequently as if you were doing a disk-based backup or a cloud-based backup where you're creating backups every few seconds. So why would you use an air gap backup? Well, it really all comes down to data protection. Because let's suppose for a moment that you get a ransomware infection. Well, ransomware can't infect what it can't touch. So if you create an online backup and that ransomware somehow finds the permissions it needs and it finds a path to that backup, there's a really good chance that the ransomware is going to attack the backup. Because remember, ransomware authors know that your backup is the number one mechanism that you have at your disposal to be able to restore everything back to normal and avoid paying the ransom. And they don't want that. They want you to pay the ransom. So they're going to do anything that they possibly can to disable or destroy your backup. So this is where air-gapped backups come into play. An air-gapped backup should be used as a supplementary backup. I mentioned a moment ago that I take a multi-tier approach to backups in my own organization. Yes, I have an online backup system that will create backups every 30 seconds, but once a day, I create an air-gapped backup to a removable hard disk. And as soon as that backup's done, I remove the hard disk. So that way, if something were to happen and my primary backups were to become compromised during a ransomware attack, then I've got an offline backup that I can use once I've cleaned up that infection. Now, that online backup isn't going to be quite as up to date as my normal online backups, but that's okay. It's better to be able to recover the vast majority of my data than to lose everything should a ransomware attack occur. Also, one of the points that I had made on the slide was, what are your policies for handling removable media if you are performing air-gapped backups? So this is something that really needs to be thought of, because if you're writing air-gapped backups, what are you doing with those backups once they're ejected? Are you just putting them in a vault somewhere in your own organization's data center? If so, who's responsible for removing the media and putting it in that vault, and for retrieving the next tape or the next removable hard drive and plugging it in? If, on the other hand, your removable media is being taken off-site, well, who's handling that, and how is that media being stored during transport and during off-site storage? I've seen a number of disasters that have occurred over the years with regard to lost media or media that was accidentally destroyed. I've seen a couple of situations where somebody left a backup tape in a hot car or a hot vehicle, and the tape ended up melting. Even myself, it was kind of a different situation, but back in the 90s, I had a mid-engine sports car, and this car didn't have a true glove compartment. Instead, it had a compartment that was between the driver's seat and the passenger seat. And I made the mistake of putting a CD in that compartment. Well, because this was a mid-engine car, that compartment was directly above the engine, and unbeknownst to me, it got really hot and melted that particular CD. So just something to think about. So the next thing that I want to talk about is assessing your backup options. Now, this is super basic, but when it comes to backing up Microsoft 365, you have three main options, and you can also use a combination of these options. The first option is to rely on retention policies. Now, retention policies are mechanisms that are natively built into the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, and their job is to give you an easy way of recovering data should it be accidentally deleted. So if, for example, you were to accidentally delete an Active Directory item, well, then you can go to the Azure Active Directory, or Intra ID as it's come to be known. I still have a tough time thinking of it in those terms, but you can go to the recycle bin and recover those items. There are also recycle bins associated with things like SharePoint and OneDrive, and of course Exchange has its deleted items folders. So there are ways of recovering data. Now, the important thing to know is that retention policies were never designed to be a backup substitute. If you have a rogue administrator who has the necessary permissions, they could easily delete items and then wipe out the retention policies so that you've got no way of recovering those items from the recycle bin. So my advice would be to use the retention policies as a convenience mechanism, not as a backup substitute. It's also worth noting that the retention period associated with the retention policies varies from one application to the next. You may find that one application has a retention period of 30 days, meaning that if something is accidentally deleted, you have 30 days to reclaim that item, whereas others might have 90 days. So the retention policies aren't consistent across applications within Microsoft 365. The second option is to use Microsoft's native Microsoft 365 backup tool. This is something that's relatively new, although not super new. It's a backup tool that exists directly within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And the good points about this particular backup tool are, one, it's integrated into Microsoft 365. It's created by Microsoft, so it's guaranteed to work with Microsoft 365. And also, it's extremely fast, because this tool will allow you to back up your data to the Microsoft 365 data center. So in other words, you don't have to worry about your data traversing a slow internet link. The data is being backed up locally on site inside Microsoft's data center, so it's extremely fast. Those are the good points about Microsoft's native backup solution that's built into Microsoft 365. The disadvantage to this tool is that it's not completely comprehensive. If you were to open this tool, you can see that it's got backup options for Exchange, SharePoint, and I think it's OneDrive, but that's it. It doesn't have a Teams backup option, for example. Incidentally, if you want to have the speed that's associated with Microsoft 365 backup, but you don't want to be subject to the limitations, Microsoft has made the API available to third-party backup vendors. So if your backup vendor doesn't offer native Microsoft backup capabilities just yet, there's a chance that they probably will down the road. And that leads me into the third option, and that's to use third-party backup software. Generally, that's the option that I would recommend, but again, features, capabilities, and costs vary widely from one vendor to the next. So let's talk about some backup features. What should you be looking for if you're using a third-party backup solution? Now, there are a huge list of features across the slide and the next, and I'm not going to go into all of these in depth because I've got a limited amount of time, but I just want to go over a few of these. Granular recovery, for example. If you're restoring Microsoft 365, you don't want to have to restore the entire tenant just because you lost a small piece of data. You should be able to restore what makes sense, whether that's a single mailbox, a single message within a mailbox, a file, or what have you. But at the same time, you do need the ability to perform larger scale restores. The bottom line is that whatever backup solution you're using, it should allow you to perform whatever type of restoration makes sense in the moment. Point in time recovery. You should be able to roll back the tenant to a previous point in time if necessary. Audit logging. That's important for diagnosis when things go wrong, but it can also be important for compliance reasons. Encryption. If you're subject to regulatory requirements, you've probably got an obligation to encrypt your backup. If you're not subject to regulatory requirements, encryption isn't always a good thing. That's something I'm going to touch on a little bit later on. Regulatory compliance. If you are subject to regulations, does the backup solution that you're using adhere to those regulatory obligations? Compatibility with Microsoft 365 and your other workloads. Microsoft 365 has been around for a really long time, and nearly any major backup product that you're going to get is compatible with Microsoft 365. The important thing is that you really want to avoid a situation where you're running multiple backup products. It's a whole lot easier to handle all of your backups using a single product. So you want to make sure whatever it is you choose is going to work with Microsoft 365, but it's also going to be able to back up anything else that you may be running, whether that's on premises or in a separate cloud or whatever. Metadata preservation. You don't want to lose metadata during a restore operation. Compatibility with backup hardware and cloud storage. So in other words, whatever backup product you choose, it's important that it allows you to make backups in a way that makes sense for your own organization based on your own unique needs. You don't want a tool that's going to force you into using a specific cloud provider storage, or that's not going to allow you to use local storage if that's what you want to do. Flexibility is important. Bulk recovery. A good backup solution should make it easy to do a large-scale recovery if that should ever become necessary. Cross-platform recovery. Let's suppose for a moment that you've got an environment set up where you're using Microsoft 365, but you still have some Office servers on premises. Maybe you've got a local Exchange server, and you have a problem with your local Exchange server, and you don't know how long it's going to take to fix that problem. So it's important to be able to recover a mailbox to a different location, namely the Microsoft 365 cloud, so that that user can get back up and running until you fix the problem, and then you can migrate that mailbox back to its original location. Scheduling. I talked about this earlier. You need to be able to create a schedule that aligns with your RPO. Retention policies. This is something I'm going to go into more a little bit later on, but you need to be able to define how long backups should be retained before they are automatically deleted. Automatic inclusion. This is another huge one that I'm going to be talking about later on. If you create new resources within Microsoft 365, such as a new user account or new data, maybe a new SharePoint site, it's important that those new resources are automatically included in your backups, that you don't have to go in and manually add those resources to your backup. Data sovereignty and privacy, I touched on earlier. You need to be able to store your data in the location that makes the most sense for you. Compression and deduplication are mechanisms that can bring down your storage cost by reducing the volume of data by eliminating redundancies. Role-based access control is important if you have multiple backup operators and need to grant each of those operators limited permissions to perform a specific task. Monitoring, alerting, and reporting. Those are relatively self-explanatory, but important nonetheless. So let's talk about some more backup features to look for. Immutability. There are some storage types that are immutable, meaning that they can't be deleted or overwritten. And that's great if you're trying to protect against ransomware. But it's also important that if you're going to use immutable storage, your backup application needs to support it. Ransomware protection is another important thing to look for. As I mentioned earlier, ransomware will seek to actively harm your backups. So some backup vendors will integrate ransomware protection into their backup products, just as a way of helping to realize if the backup is under attack and taking some steps to thwart that attack. Support for backup tiers. I talked about this a little bit earlier. An example of a backup tier is creating a primary backup, but then creating a secondary air-gapped backup to go along with it. A user-friendly interface. This is one of those things that is often overlooked, yet I tend to think of it as being extremely important, even though maybe it doesn't seem that way. And the reason why I say that is because there was a period of time when the trend was to create backup applications that were way overcomplicated. For whatever reason, a lot of the vendors had the idea that, hey, we're creating an enterprise product, we're selling it at a high price point, so therefore it needs to be mind-bogglingly complicated to use. And the idea was then they could sell training, they could sell support. In my opinion, it's best to look for a backup that is really simple to use, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you have to perform an emergency restoration and nobody can figure out how to use the backup product without calling support. Restore should be absolutely intuitive. And the same thing for creating backups. If your backup product is overcomplicated, then there's a really good chance you're going to misconfigure it and not protect the data that you think you're protecting. So look for a user-friendly interface. API access that will allow you to back up any applications that you develop in-house by linking into that API. Multi-tenant support. It's becoming increasingly common for organizations to set up multiple Microsoft 365 tenants. So it's a good idea to have a backup product that can back up more than one tenant. Support for both large and small organizations, because even if you're running a small organization, that organization may grow into something larger over time, and you don't want to run into a limit with regard to what your backup software can handle. Availability of support and vendor reputation, documentation and training, all important things. So let's move on and talk about another best practice. The next thing on the list is determining the scope of your backup. So I talked about this first one a little bit earlier on. Which services do you need to protect? Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams? Again, my recommendation would be to back up absolutely everything, whether you need it or not, because your needs may change over time, or you may find that one of the applications stores data in somewhere that in a location within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem that you're not necessarily expecting. The next consideration, do you need to back up user-generated content, shared mailboxes, public folders, things that might seem just a little bit outside of the norm? You know, pretty much every backup application out there for Microsoft 365 is going to be able to back up an Exchange mailbox. But over the years, I have seen a couple of backup applications that are lacking in some ways. I remember actually seeing a backup application once that specifically said that it won't back up Exchange public folders. So it's really important to review the documentation for whatever backup application you're considering and make sure that it will protect the data types that you need to protect. Another consideration is how will you handle inactive, legacy, or deprovisioned data? As an example of this, let's suppose that you've got a user who decides to leave the organization. So you delete the user account, but before you do that, you detach the user's Exchange mailbox because there may or may not be important data in that mailbox. And you haven't relinked that mailbox to another account yet because maybe you haven't hired a replacement for the person who left. So you've just got this orphaned mailbox that's hanging around. How are you going to make sure that that mailbox is being backed up and protected? It's important to make sure that your backup application can handle situations like that. So moving on, the next thing that I want to talk about is retention policies. And I talked about retention policies a little bit earlier from the standpoint of retention policies that are natively integrated into Microsoft 365, such as the SharePoint recycle bin or the Enter ID recycle bin and things like that. But there are other types of retention policies that can come into play. Typically, organizations will create retention policies both for their original data and for their backups. And at the very simplest, a retention policy simply refers to how long do I need to keep this data? And that can stem from business requirements, or it can stem from compliance requirements, or some combination of the two. So typically what you want to do is assess what are the business requirements for my data, what compliance obligations do I have, and then build your retention policies around the more stringent of the two requirements. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose for a moment that your organization is subject to a compliance mandate that says that you have to hang on to email messages for 5 years. And I'm not picking any particular policy here, I'm just throwing that out as an example. But let's also say that you have an operational requirement within the organization that mandates hanging on to mailbox data for 6 years. Well, in a situation like that, you would want to set the retention policy to 6 years just because your business has a need for 6-year-old email, even though that far exceeds what the legal compliance requirement would be. So you need to choose the more stringent of the two requirements. The next question is, how are you going to implement those retention policies? And typically you're going to implement retention policies in two different places. You'll do it in one place for the original data and in a separate place for the backups. Because remember, backup retention policies dictate how long backups are going to be stored. Retention policies surrounding your original data dictate how long that original data needs to be retained. And this brings up another point. Are you going to need an automated data lifecycle management tool to go along with the retention policies? So what that really refers to is a retention policy at its simplest just dictates how long data must be kept. There's no rule that says that you can't keep the data longer than what the retention policy requires. It's just that you have to keep your data at least as long as what the retention policy mandates. Where automated data lifecycle management comes into play is deciding what happens after that retention policy expires. So what do you want to do? Do you want to just leave the data alone and keep it indefinitely? That's a perfectly valid option, and that is totally okay. Some organizations, though, will try to decrease their storage cost by setting up an automated data lifecycle management policy to delete old data once it's no longer needed, or to move that data to an archive. The important thing is to have an automated system that will handle that on your behalf so that you're not having to manually move data around. Also, how will the retention policies impact your short-term and long-term storage requirements? Because if you're setting up a retention policy that mandates data being kept for a certain length of time, then presumably your backup storage requirements are going to increase, as are your primary data storage requirements. So that's something that you're probably going to have to plan for within your next capacity planning cycle. Another thing to consider is backup frequency. And this is something that I talked about a little bit earlier. Backup frequency is tied to RPO. In other words, how often are you going to be creating your backups? Are hourly backups sufficient? Can you get away with backing up once per day? Do you need near real-time backups? And the second point behind that is, does the backup frequency support your RPO? So if your organization has a certain recovery point objective, are you backing up data frequently enough to meet that RPO? And then the third point, which seems a little bit odd, but can you create synthetic recovery points? Now, the reason why I mention this is that sometimes the backup frequency and the recovery point frequency can be two completely different things. Let me give you an example. I mentioned earlier that in my own organization, I perform backups every 30 seconds. However, the backup software that I'm using only creates recovery points once per hour. So every 30 seconds, I'm moving data up to my backup server, but there's no recovery point that exists for most of that. The recovery points are only generated once per hour. So let's suppose for a moment that I were to have a crash 45 minutes after the hour, and I need to restore. Now, what would be the point of making backups every 30 seconds if I'm going to lose 45 minutes worth of data because I have to go back to the last created recovery point, which was from 45 minutes ago? Well, in a situation like that, you really don't want to be losing all of that data. So what a lot of the backup software will allow you to do is generate a synthetic recovery point. In other words, you can say, okay, no recovery point exists for this, but I've got another 45 minutes worth of backups that have accumulated since the last recovery point was made. Let's make a recovery point from that. So having the ability to create these synthetic recovery points is super important. Another thing to consider is coverage gaps. So are there any users or groups or services that you're not backing up? And if so, is that behavior intentional? And have your needs changed? Now, this is another one of those things that sounds really weird, but over the years, I've worked in a couple of organizations that actually excluded certain data from their backups, and they had a very good reason for doing that. In one case, that data was actually covered by a completely separate backup, and if it was to be included in that primary backup, the two would have fought with each other and caused all kinds of data corruption issues. So there was a very good reason for omitting the data from one of the backups. In another situation, when I worked for the military, there was certain data that wasn't included in the primary backups because that data was classified and had to be handled in a totally different way. So sometimes there are very valid reasons for omitting data from backups. But if data is being omitted from backups, it's important to A, identify that data, and B, periodically assess whether your needs have changed and whether that data is still being handled in the appropriate manner or if it needs to be added to the backup. So another thing to think about is, what are you doing to ensure that newly created resources are being automatically backed up? This is one of those things that most backup software will handle it no problem. If you create a new user in your Microsoft 365 environment, typically you'll find that that new user gets backed up. The same with if you create a new SharePoint site or a new mailbox, typically that is going to be automatically backed up, but it's still important to check. You know, before this presentation began, Keith and I were talking about the old days of virtualization and the introduction of Hyper-V. And one of the pain points that I remember from that is that when Hyper-V first came out, if you were to create a new virtual machine, that virtual machine wasn't automatically added to your backup. You would typically have to go in and manually add that virtual machine to the backup. So if you think about how frequently most of us create and delete virtual machines, you can imagine the overhead related to that and just how much work it would have been to ensure that everything that needs to be backed up is being backed up. Well, when it comes to Microsoft 365, you want to avoid a situation like that at all costs. It's really important to make sure that as resources are created and deleted within the Microsoft 365 tenant, your backup adjusts to that dynamically so that you're never ever having to manually add Microsoft 365 resources to your backups. And then the last question on this slide is, how can you verify that all of your data is indeed being backed up? So in other words, is there a report that you can run to make sure that what you think is being backed up truly is being backed up? So another consideration is, where are your backups being stored? And do you have enough storage to accommodate future growth? Also, is there an option for replicating your backups elsewhere? Early on, there was something called the 3-2-1 rule for backups. Now, this rule hasn't aged well because it was created in a pre-cloud era, so it doesn't really apply all that much today. But even so, the basic spirit of this rule, I think, is still totally valid. The idea behind the 3-2-1 rule is that you need to have 3 copies of your data in order to fully protect that data. So those 3 copies being the original data and 2 separate backups. The 2 stood for backups stored on 2 different types of media, and then the 1 was 1 copy stored off-site. So that way, if your data center were to burn down, you've still got a backup that's stored somewhere else. So the 3-2-1 rule doesn't really apply to the cloud era, but the basic philosophy behind that rule still applies. And that philosophy being that it's important to have backup redundancy, because if something were to go wrong with your one and only backup, well, then you're basically out of luck at that point. So it's really important to have multiple copies of your backup. And generally, this is going to mean replicating your backup to another location. So it's really important to make sure that whatever backup solution you're using, it gives you the ability to replicate that backup elsewhere and to choose where that secondary location is going to be. Another point on the slide is your storage encrypted? And keep in mind that if you're not subject to regulatory compliance obligations, then encryption may or may not be desirable depending on the situation. And this is something that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and I said I would touch on a little bit more in depth later on. The reason why encryption may or may not be desirable has to do with the potential for data loss. Over the years, I've seen a couple of situations in which an organization was creating tape backups and encrypting those backups, but during a disaster, they lost the encryption key, meaning that they were unable to restore their backups simply because they lost the encryption key as a part of the disaster and had no way of decrypting the backups. So that's certainly something to think about. Now, the way that I handle encryption in my own organization is through my multi-tier approach to backups. Without getting into too much detail, I have a primary backup server that creates backups every 30 seconds. I've mentioned that a few times already. So I also create air-gapped backups to removable hard drives, which I also talked about. And generally, I'll create those air-gapped backups once a day. Typically, when I'm ready to shut down for the evening, the last thing that I'll do is create an air-gapped backup. So that way, I've got primary backups being made every 30 seconds, air-gapped backups being made once a day. Now, I also create immutable backups as a third backup tier, just so that if everything else goes wrong, I've got those to fall back on. But given the cost and the amount of time that it creates to create an immutable backup, I generally only do those about once a month. So they're not very current at all, but in a dire emergency, at least I could recover most of my data. Now, the thing is, if I ever find myself in a situation where I'm restoring from my immutable backups, it means that something has gone horribly wrong, because at that point, I'm assuming that my primary backups and my air gap backups are both invalid. So in a situation like that, I really, really don't want to run into a situation where, oh, my last and final hope for recovering my backup is encrypted and I don't have an encryption key, or something has gone wrong, the encryption key is not being recognized. So my immutable backups are not encrypted, but my primary and air gap backups are. So I just wanted to give you something to think about with regard to backup storage encryption. So then the next thing to think about is documentation. And I'm rapidly running out of time, so I don't want to go into this in too much depth. But the idea is that backup testing is important because you want to make sure that your backups are actually going to be able to recover what you need them to recover. But it's equally important to document your recovery procedures as you work through that backup testing. The reason for this is that recovery situations tend to be high stress. And anytime you're in a high stress situation, it's easy to make mistakes. So it's important to have documentation that outlines the procedures step by step, just to minimize the chance of human error occurring during a recovery. And as you create this documentation, it's also important to document who is going to be responsible for what permissions they have, what's their contact information in case they're not in the office at the time. In other words, you should be creating a document that can walk you through the entire recovery procedure and that establishes all of the necessary details. Another thing that I want to talk about is monitoring and maintenance for your backups. So first of all, who in your organization is going to be responsible for reviewing backup logs and reports? Now, a lot of backup applications, I would probably say even most backup applications, can generate alerts if things go wrong. Having said that though, my advice would be to not rely on alerts. Actually take the time to look at the reports or the backup logs. The reason for that is that alerts can fail. I've seen situations where an organization will make a change to an unrelated part of the infrastructure, but the backup software's alerting system just happened to use that part of the infrastructure, and now all of a sudden alerts aren't working and the organization has no idea that there's a problem. So don't rely solely on alerts. Take the time to either create backup reports or to review the backup logs. Also, who's responsible for keeping the backup documentation up to date? I talked about the importance of establishing comprehensive documentation for the backup and recovery procedures, but that documentation can quickly fall out of date. So it's a good idea to have a procedure in place for reviewing the documentation on a periodic basis and making whatever updates happen to be necessary. Also, what's the plan for updating the backup roadmap? Because presumably your backup requirements are going to change over time. And a lot of times you can get a feel for what those changes might be in advance. So having a backup roadmap might not be a bad idea. Who's going to track backup software and API updates to make sure that they're not going to cause operational or compliance problems? Most of the time when the backup vendors create an update, those updates will address security problems or fix bugs. But I have seen maybe one or two examples over the years where a vendor made an update and it ended up causing some major problems. Maybe a function that an organization relied on was no longer supported, so they removed it from the software, leaving the organization unable to do what they needed to do. And I can think of at least one example that I've seen where a backup vendor made a change and it caused a compliance or a compliance problem for an organization. So in addition to tracking what the updates are, you have to consider what are the consequences of updating versus not updating. As an example of this, when Microsoft Teams first came out, most backup applications didn't have a way of directly backing up Teams. Instead, they would back up Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive and some of the other applications, but it was up to the organization itself to kind of reassemble that data in order to support Teams backup and recovery. Later on, though, Microsoft created a Teams API so that backup applications could natively back up and recover Teams. The problem was it took a little while for that API to make its way into the various backup products. So even once that happened, there were organizations that were still running outdated backup applications. And many didn't realize that because they hadn't updated in a while, they didn't they could have been backing up teams much more easily than what they were doing. Also, who's responsible for capacity planning? That goes back to documentation. How will backup patch management be handled? And what's the procedure for performing a periodic assessment to see if the organization would benefit from a different backup product? Now, switching to a different backup product isn't something to be undertaken lightly, because presumably you still have backups that were created with the product that you're using now, and there may someday come a reason why you would have to restore one of those. So switching to a different backup product isn't something to take on lightly, but at the same time, sometimes it is justified. So my advice would be to come up with some sort of procedure to periodically assess what you're using, make sure it's meeting your needs, make sure that the backup vendor is keeping pace with changes to technology, and maybe even establish some criteria for coming up with a different backup solution. So the very last thing that I want to talk about is something that actually kind of stems from my experience in the space program, and that's post-incident evaluation. One of the things about training to go to space is that after every training exercise, there is an exhaustive debrief that occurs. And if I'm to be totally honest with you, this is one of my least favorite parts of the training process, just because it's tedious and cumbersome and time consuming. And it always happens immediately after a training exercise when everybody's exhausted from whatever they've just put us through. But in spite of all of that, it's something that is extraordinarily important. Now, in the world of spaceflight training, the way that this works is that the first thing that we do is we sit down and we establish what happened. Somebody will go through and, based on the notes that they've taken, or in some cases based on their memory, they construct a timeline of everything that happened during the training exercise. And then they go around the room and everybody has a chance to add to that or to refute something that was on the list. And then once we've established a timeline, then each person is given an opportunity in turn to talk about any lessons learned, what went right, what went wrong, what should have been done different, whether it applies to them or towards another crew member or what have you. So depending on the exercise, this typically takes a couple of hours to complete, but even so, it tends to be worthwhile just because there are often lessons learned, and those lessons learned are incorporated into future training exercises and mission prep. Well, the same thing can be done for backups, because if you have a major restoration that has to take place, and I'm not talking about just a user accidentally deleted a file, so we restore that file for them, but I'm talking about a major restoration. No matter how much planning you've put into it, there's always going to be some lesson learned. So it's a good idea to document what went right, what went wrong, and take those lessons that are learned and add those lessons into your incident recovery plan. So with that said, I am just about out of time. I've probably gone longer than I'm supposed to, but I want to take a few minutes here at the end and open it up for any questions that anybody might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Brien. A fantastic presentation. I think extremely illuminating today. Just great stuff. So we do have a bunch of questions that have come in. So let's get to a few of those that we can right now. First one I see here comes from Lawrence, who wants to know what is the reference to air and air gapped? And I would actually expand that a little bit here, Brien, to say, can you define for us not only air gapped, but its kind of partner, which you hear a lot about, which is immutability? Now, you talked about both of these today, but can you define and maybe distinguish between air gapped and immutable backups?
Yeah, absolutely. So an air gap backup is just a backup that's written to removal media, and then the important part is that once the backup has been completed, that media is ejected. So that way, if the system containing that media were to become infected, it can't compromise that air-gapped backup because that backup has already been ejected. It's completely separate from the system and ransomware can't touch it. Now, having said that, one of the risks that you run with air-gapped backups is that if you don't completely clean that infection and then you insert that air-gapped backup to perform a restoration, there's a really good chance that that air-gapped backup is going to become damaged or infected. So it's extremely important to make sure that you clear up any infections before you try to reinsert an air gap backup. That's where immutability comes into play. An immutable backup is a backup that cannot be altered by any means. It's written to media that can only be written to once. Well, actually, there's a few different forms of immutability, but The idea being that if a ransomware infection occurs, it can't make any alterations to your air gap or to your immutable backup. It can't delete the air gap or immutable backup. So it's just another layer of protection. Ransomware can't touch it. What can happen is that if ransomware tries to modify the backup, it may create additional layers on top of the immutability, but your original immutable backup remains untouched and you can still restore from that.
And that is so important too. I would add to that something here, Brien, to your excellent overview. One thing that I find often that admins may be a little bit lax on is verifying the integrity of their backups. A lot of times you go to use a backup and something has gone wrong, but you didn't even know it because you didn't check if that backup is actually clean, your last known good, et cetera. Do you find the same kind of thing?
Yeah, and I would actually add to that, verifying the integrity alone isn't enough. I saw a situation quite a few years back where somebody had backed up a Windows server and the backup verified as being perfectly fine. But what nobody knew was that one of the critical boot files was missing off that server. It had been deleted or become corrupted, who knows what. So one day somebody installs an update, they go to reboot that server, and of course the boot process fails because it's missing a critical file. So they figure, okay, no problem. We just backed this up a couple days ago. We'll restore the backup. Well, that file was missing at the time that the backup was made. So the backup didn't do them any good. It just put the server back to the same state it was already in. So the point being that just verifying that a backup is good isn't enough, because that only makes sure that the backup matches what's on the server that they're backing up. The important thing is to do backup testing. That's the only way to truly know if your backup is 100% good.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. Ransomware is not dying; it's not slowing, and it is getting more and more ravenous all the time. We're not seeing any slowdown at all because it's proven to be so extremely impactful. Companies are paying up, and there's all kinds of issues that are ongoing with that. So that is just great information. I think we have time for one more question here, Brien, and this comes from Aditya today. And Aditya wants to know, let's see, you referenced this, but I wonder if you can do a little bit deeper dive. What are the most critical data protection gaps in M365 that enterprises should address when planning their backup strategies?
I'm sorry, I lost you for a second. Did you say the
Oh,
most
sure.
critical data,
What are
data protection gaps?
that you're finding in M365 that enterprises need to be aware of? You referenced it before. I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper on that.
Yeah, most of the current generation backup products are pretty good about not having a lot of gaps. A lot of them you can just say, I want to back up my Microsoft 365 tenant, and it will go to it. But where I really tend to see gaps is with organizations that are still relying on older backup software that, yes, technically it's Microsoft 365 compatible, but it was written several years ago and hasn't been updated. So it may not recognize everything out there. I threw out Teams as an example. That's certainly a data protection gap. Another data protection gap I would say with some of these is just not replicating the backups. You're creating a backup, but there's no backup of the backup per se, which puts the organization in a very vulnerable position. Those are kind of the biggest gaps that I tend to see in the real world.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Brien, this has been an absolute delight to have you on today. Thank you for educating us on M365 backups, the critical things you need to know. These checklists are just so useful. And I think if people implement them, they're going to be much, much safer in this current era, which feels to me in a lot of ways like the wild, wild west, doesn't it? With everything that's out there, all the automated attacks and everything else that is coming for your data. So thanks again for being on with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, everyone. Well, that was Brien. Didn't I tell you he was a great presenter? And I was not kidding about that, was I? So before we let you get out of here today, there's one more piece of business to take care of, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. We have $250 today, and we do have a winner, in fact, and that winner is Mario Salinas from Texas. So congratulations. Congratulations. I bet it feels super to win, Mario. Hey, see what I did there, everyone? All right, Mario, we are going to be in touch to get you your card ASAP, so sit tight. And with that, folks, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors, Rubric and Cohesity, for making this event possible today. I want to thank Brien for being here with us and for such an amazing presentation. Thanks to you attendees, as always, for being here, for your great questions. It was so much fun to spend part of my Friday with you, and I can't wait to see you in the next event. That's about it for me today, folks. Have a great rest of your day.